Hello students, thanks for watching. Today we're going to talk about location. So let's say you've decided that you want to open a ramen shop. And maybe by now you consider yourself an expert in business management. And there's a lot of things to consider. However, the first thing that you'll do, and the most important thing that you'll do, is determine the location of your ramen shop. So you have done some careful study and you have narrowed it down to two possible locations. Option A and option B are very different. This is the city of Osaka. It's a very large city. And option A is right in the middle of it. There are crowds of people walking back and forth in front of the location all the time. There are bright lights. It's got everything. Option B is a little different, and it may not seem as exciting, but it is an equally valid choice. Option B is out in the suburbs on a sleepy street. So, how are we going to determine which is a better location? We see ramen shops in both of these locations, so clearly both choices are viable options. How do people go about making these decisions, and how will we go about making the decision of location? Well, the term we need to use is optimal location. Optimal location is the best location that gives us a combination of quantitative and qualitative factors. Now, hopefully by now we understand what these terms mean. So, what are these quantitative and qualitative factors that we should be considering? This should kind of feel like review for you, but quantitative factors, everything that involves numbers or quantities. Right? So anything that our finance department can look at that can be broken into a numerical value, we need to consider these. And when you look at these two options, there should be two things that jump out really quickly. You might think, well, option A, the rent is going to be higher. We're going to pay more per month for our location. And there's a higher potential for sales. Naturally, the potential for sales is going to be completely different on these, and the rent is going to be completely different. But there are some other things as well. The wages might be higher, might be lower in one location or another. Typically, in places like option A, in the middle of the city, we might need to pay people just a little bit more. Cost of living is higher. There are a whole lot of other things that we can look at, though. One, capital expenditure required. Are we going to need to purchase some things or make investments up front? Are we going to need to buy a sign or some machines or anything like that in order to get started? Part of that is site costs as well. Site costs. Do we need to outfit this location? Do we need to install a counter? Do we need to modify the windows? Things like that. What are the unemployment rates nearby? Is it going to be easy to hire people because the unemployment rate is very high? Are people not going to have this income to spend because the unemployment rate is really high? The price per unit. You might not have considered that, but you can maybe charge more for the same product in two different locations. You can maybe charge more in site A or more in site B, depending on some of those factors. The fixed costs and variable costs. This should be kind of like a review. I just want you to think about all of those from Unit 3. Transportation costs, cash inflows, government grants. All of these are things that need to be factored in. They're quantitative, they're numerical, and they must be considered before we decide on A or B. So let's take a look at some of the ways that we might use some of these figures and some of the problems that we might see from this particular section of the course. There are some techniques and tools that can be used for these quantitative factors, and these are all things that we've studied already. We can give a profit estimate. So you might be given some numbers, and it might encourage you to determine the potential profit on each one of the locations. But profit's not everything. As we learned when we talked about investment appraisal, there are some other things. The payback period needs to be considered. The average annual rate of return needs to be considered as well. So we have investment appraisal that we can do. And the other one that they mention is the break-even analysis. How many bowls of ramen will we need to sell in order to start turning a profit. Let's take a peek. Profit estimates, for example, they might go ahead and give you something like this. Very simple. Estimated annual costs, estimated sales, price per unit. Let's figure out the profit. And we can see here, based on these numbers, it looks like location A is better. We have a higher profit. So if we stop there, okay, location A will make more profit. But we can't just stop at profit. We need to also talk about the average rate of return and the payback period. These are our tools for investment appraisal. So now we can see a little more information on location A and location B. And it looks like location B is a little better as far as it goes for appraising it as a smart investment. We have more of a rate of return and we have a shorter payback period. Finally, the break-even quantity is something to consider as well. It also looks like maybe location B is starting to look a little better. We'll have to sell fewer bowls of ramen in order to start turning a profit, and so that's a good thing as well. You might look at these different numbers, these different tools, and say, okay, well, do I do location A, location B? And there is no correct answer, and this is very typical, but you need to make a determination based on the figures. So what do we do? Do we do location A? Well, we have a higher profit, and maybe profit is really all that we're looking to consider. Do we do location B? Well, it's less risky. It seems like there's less work involved as far as breaking even. Maybe for certain businesses, this is the better option. And you just need to come to a decision and be able to justify it based on the numbers that you see. And if you do that, you'll be using the quantitative factors that are important in determining your optimal location. Okay. So let's change it up a little bit and say we don't want to do bowls of ramen anymore. That we have figured that the best way to do it is to enter the secondary sector. We can open up a ramen factory. We can fulfill our passion for ramen noodles, and we can do it in a different way. We'll mass produce ramen noodles, we'll package them up, and then we'll sell them to grocery stores. This is a great business model, and after looking at some of the numbers with these ramen shops, we've decided this is the business we want to go into. Okay, well, that's going to change our location a little bit, and let's start looking nationwide. We have two options here. We have option A and we have option B. Option A is in Osaka, maybe just outside of town because it's a big factory. And option B is off in the countryside in the north of Japan. So how are we going to determine this? Well, clearly we have our quantitative numbers, and let's look at it. Location A and location B. We have so precisely scouted the locations that everything is completely equal. We expect the same profit, same investment appraisal, same break-even quantity. So how are we going to make a decision in this case? Well, this is when we bring in qualitative factors. And there are quite a few to consider, but qualitative factors are very important to consider for determining our optimal location. Let's walk through them real quick. First off, safety. Yes, there could be an explosion in the factory, something like that. And we need to determine whether environment A or environment B is a more safe environment for us and our various members of the community and our employees and other stakeholders. Room for expansion. If we go with option A, location A, well, there's not much room for expansion if we get larger. However, option B is off in a field somewhere and it gives us lots of room for expansion. So looking to the future, we want to consider that. I think number 3 is an important one to consider as well, is managers' preferences. I put a couple examples up there. Some people just like living in certain locations. They like living in the city or they like living in the country. In the city, there are entertainment things like baseball games. An easy example you could use for managers' preference is weather. I don't want to live in a place where it's super cold and snowy. Some people love it in the cold and snow. Some people want to live on the beach. But weather is a good example for managers' preferences. Another one that is super important to consider is the labor supply. Do you have workers? We mentioned Osaka is a big city. There are about 20 million people living in the greater Osaka area. But in option B, there might only be 3 million people living in the entire region. So you're going to have a smaller labor supply. There are environmental concerns as well. So maybe option A is on a brown field or is a former site that had waste, and by opening your factory there, you'll actually be improving the environment. But maybe option B, there's some sort of endangered field mice that live out there, and that environmental groups are going to be upset, and you need to consider that as well. Another one is infrastructure. Infrastructure is very important for certain industries, but it is important for all industries. For example, with our ramen factory, let's say we have some investors coming to town. Is there an airport nearby? Or are they going to have to fly into Tokyo and ride a bus for 6 hours to get to our factory? If there's an airport nearby, oh, we can pick you up in 30 minutes. Some industries, for example, the natural gas industry, drilling for oil and gas, there might be 1 trillion cubic feet of oil in the North Arctic tundra. But unless there's a road to get out there, unless there are pipelines to get out there, unless there's electricity out there, we can't get it. So part of expanding and using location for that business is figuring out if infrastructure even exists out there. Another one is the pull of the market. Now, the text kind of discounts this, but I think that it is a little important. The pull of the market is getting less and less important as we start buying things online and the internet becomes a larger part of our life. However, I noticed this boba tea stuff, and one thing that I noticed is there is a lot of it in places like Osaka where there are a lot of tourists. Tourists line up to buy this stuff. So if we are wanting to open up a boba tea place, maybe Osaka is a good choice simply because the pull of the market, there's a demand for this stuff where there are tourists. Now, I could have another city that is of a similar size but doesn't have as many tourists, and there's not a demand for boba tea. If there's a demand in the market, it really can shift in certain situations where you want to locate. Another one's planning restrictions. Some of the times you can't even build where you want to build because the government will tell you how the land is to be used. In our picture here, we have residential and we have agricultural zoning, and you can see it right there on the map. People can't just choose to build a factory or a store anywhere if it's zoned for residential or some other purpose. This one is a little complicated, external economies of scale. And one thing that they're describing is something that another word for it might be agglomeration. We notice that certain industries tend to locate near each other. So it might be wise if we are opening a ramen factory, believe it or not, to open up next to another ramen factory. That way we have some advantages of being next to our competitors. We can hire their employees, we have access to their labor, their expertise. It actually is very beneficial. You'll notice that Burger King and McDonald's are always seem to be locating next to each other. Now, you might think that that would hurt business, but in a lot of ways, it actually helps business for restaurants to locate around their competitors. Another one is ethics, and we are going to talk more on this one later, so stay tuned for that. The final thing to mention about choosing the optimal location is you might choose to have multi-site locations. Maybe we are going to just have 2 ramen factories, and clearly 2 is better than 1, right? I mean, it's more convenient. There are lower transportation costs to get to different markets. There is less risk for a supply chain disruption. So if one factory goes out, then we still have another one making our ramen. And it gives you the power to delegate between the 2 branches, and you can, empower those below you and make fewer decisions. And this can be seen as a pro for some people. However, clearly there are cons. It's more expensive to open 2 factories than it is to open 1, so you have to have the necessary capital for that. There are coordination problems when you have 2. Maybe some people are doing something different and you don't like that, and now you have to coordinate between the 2 the right way to do something. That can lead to culture problems as well. Perhaps in one location they have one sort of corporate culture, one sort of way of doing things, and then the other one they develop a different way. That can be a problem. And then this thing, cannibalism. If you open up Let's go back to the ramen shops, and you open up 20 ramen shops in Osaka. Well, in theory, each one that you open in a way could steal customers from your other location, and you are actually competing with yourself, and they call that cannibalism. Okay, so let's talk about maybe some things on a larger scale. Ramen Co. This is a large, well established ramen making business, and they have their production facility right on site. They have all four of their functional departments in a large headquarters. They make a lot of money, and they have noticed that there is a new competitor and they're starting to lose their market share. And what they need to do is reduce their operating costs. Now, you probably have studied, and there are many ways to reduce your operating costs, but location is also one of them. And this is where we talk about the second part of this chapter, and it involves ramen companies' ability to think and act globally. So, one thing that they can do is they can relocate their HR and they can stick them in another part of the world. And they can take their production facilities and they can move it down to yet another part of the world. And you can look at Ramen Co. now, and they are all over the world. And they have done the process of offshoring. So they have sent some parts of their business, their production, and their human resources to be done across the globe. And this will help them reduce costs. We'll talk more about that. Another option is to have another company come up and say, oh, we can do your production for you. We can make the ramen noodles for you. Just hire us, a totally different company, and we'll do it. And someone else might say, we'll do your HR for you over here. You can just have us do it, and you can outsource it. So this is outsourcing. This is when you hire another company to do a part of your business. Now, if you outsource, then you have reduced the size of your company and you don't have to worry about production and you don't have to worry about human resources. And now your company might look a little more like this. It's a little smaller over at Ramen Co., but they have other companies doing part of their functions for them. So let's talk about outsourcing just a little bit. And one of the big examples of outsourcing are these call centers. Call centers are a major industry in countries like India and the Philippines. And they are businesses that will answer calls for you. And so by doing this, you don't have to answer your own phone. You don't have to, if a customer has a question or a complaint, they can call this business and not Ramen Co. So why would you do this? Well, it reduces operating costs. You can also control your operating costs a little better. So you can hire people in a different part of the world at a different rate of pay who will do the job for less money. And you can also hire them at maybe certain times of the year. Around Christmas time, we need a lot of people answering the phones with questions. And then later on, we don't really need people. So it gives you control of those operating costs. It gives you a little more flexibility with your time and money. So you can choose to do other things with your time as a business than sit around and answer the phone all day. You can focus on the big picture. How can we grow as a company? How can we improve our products? You can also get access to skills and specialists. One great example is this. The picture is of India, and in India, there are a lot of people that speak English. And so maybe a company in a place like Japan or in a place like Brazil where there are fewer people that speak English, that's a skill that they don't have, and they get access to it if they outsource their call centers. We also, have some negative sides as well. It results in a loss of jobs within the company. If you outsource a call center, then there are people with your company that are no longer going to be necessary. They're going to be redundant, and you're going to lay them off. It can lead to some quality issues. You are relying on another company, another business to do part of your job. And that can also lead to customer dissatisfaction. In general, people don't like it when they're trying to call your company and they wind up going to another company that's answering the phone. There's sort of a negative stigma on these call centers, and generally we see that customers are dissatisfied when you do this. There are also possibly security issues. If you have some trade secrets, some intellectual property, things like that, you are allowing other people to maybe have access to some of it. So Let's talk about another example now. Offshoring, and this is the Apple iPhone factory complex in China. Um, Apple is an American company. Everyone knows Apple all over the world. And their iPhones, about 50% or more of their iPhones are made here in China at this location. They've opened this up in the past few years. It is a huge complex, as you can see. There are thousands and thousands of employees, and there is an entire city that is built around this iPhone factory complex. This is one of the best examples of offshoring. They have chosen to make their phones in China. Now, they could have chosen any place in the world. They're Apple. They could have made them in the United States, their home country. They could have moved it down to Mexico. They could have moved it to Europe, Japan, anywhere. Anyone would have been happy to have this factory. But the operations management team at Apple decided that this was the best place for them. They weighed out the qualitative factors and the quantitative factors, and they determined this is what we need to do. This is a massive, massive investment. It's billions of dollars. It's the most important decision that you can make if you're on the operations management team. You can only do it once. It is a big deal. And so they went over all of the numbers and all of the factors and determined that they were going to build their factory here. Now, it's really easy to see why you can do that. You can hire people in China at a lower rate. You can pay them less. They have access to technologies that allow them to make the iPhone up to the standard that they want. And you can do it while reducing your operating costs massively. So this allows Apple to sell an iPhone at a lower rate than if they had their factory anywhere else. But there are some issues that come. One is that there are language issues. You need people who speak the same language. There can be cultural issues as well. Sometimes quality issues. You might not make as high quality a product. There are supply chain issues. Now, with the supply chain, it might be difficult for you to get the iPhone from China to your markets that you want to sell them at. And there are also some ethical issues as well. So let's talk about that because we were going to revisit ethics, and I think this is the time to talk about it. When you offshore your production facilities, for example, and when you outsource your HR and you allow another business to do that for you, there are people that have some very legitimate and valid concerns about whether that's the right thing to do. For example, the factories will most likely close in the home country. Very often this involves relocation of an existing facility, and you're going to close it and move it to China. This is in the news all the time. It makes people very upset. Politicians talk about it. It's definitely questionable whether it's the right thing to do to lay off hundreds or thousands of workers. But at the same time, we can see that in places around the world like China, it helps with the development of the economy over there. Quality of life definitely goes up in some of these areas. And it allows people around the world and in the home country to buy cheaper goods. They want to buy things for less, and offshoring or outsourcing can allow you to lower your prices. However, there can be some complaints. Maybe they're exploiting the workers. There have been reports of very long shifts, and a big reason to offshore and to move to these places is because there are fewer labor laws and there's a lower minimum wage, and maybe this is exploitation to work people longer and to pay them less. But in the end, it does lead to a lot more profit for the business. And that is what businesses are usually trying to do. And it goes back to the shareholders. And if you have invested in the stock market or you've invested in shares for the company, then you want these companies to be profitable. But, maybe at what cost? There are also in these home countries, they have some concerns as well in places like India and China. Is it good for companies like Apple to go in to open a factory and then all of the profits that they make off of the people's labor does return to the home country largely? And so are they exploiting these places and removing their labor and turning it into profit for themselves. But there are some good things that happen as well. There are businesses that open specifically to cater to these large multinational corporations. And so it can help to spur some startups and some small businesses in these new countries. But in general, people are going to protest it and be upset with it, and it's going to be an issue most of the time, and you're going to have an ethical dilemma, and you're going to need to figure out what to do, and it's not an easy call. What we have found is that most companies are offshoring from their home countries, places like the United States and Japan and Europe, into these other places like China and India and Bangladesh and the Philippines, because it's more profitable, because it allows them to offer goods at a lower price, and because they consider it to be in the best interest of the business. So, if they ask you about ethics for a business and operations management, you can always talk about offshoring location issues. It's a great one to talk about. And because it's such an ethical issue and there are people that are upset about it, a lot of these companies have taken their production facilities and their parts of their business they have outsourced, and they have been bringing them back to their home countries. So that does happen as well. And that brings us to our last two vocabulary terms, which is insourcing and inshoring. If you take that production facility in China and you bring it back to the United States, you are inshoring. And when you decide to do something in-house, when you have your HR return to the company and you hire your own employees and do it yourself, it's considered insourcing. So that pretty much covers location and everything that we need to know about it. I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you in class.